My name is Winnifred Louis. I'm a professor in psychology here in Australia, and the panel that we're in today is called Why Do They Go After Universities? Feedback Loops Between Academic Repression and Democratic Backsliding and Advice from the Coalface. And each of our speakers is a scholar with experience in this area, as well as lived experience of this area, academic repression. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I want to acknowledge that this event is part of our Festival of Australian Democracy and Human Rights, and I'll put a link in the chat if you haven't heard about that and you want to click through and see some of the other events. In addition, I want to acknowledge country, which is a tradition here in Australia, recognizing the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and their unceded sovereignty. So the University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet. Here in Melbourne, where I'm based right now, I believe it's the Wurundjeri people. And I acknowledge the ancestors and their descendants and acknowledge their ongoing contribution and connection to country. And that's relevant, of course, because the academic freedom, as well as other freedoms of the Indigenous scholars and advocates, have persistently been infringed throughout colonization. This presentation is being recorded for later use. Those who do not wish to be recorded can indicate to us and we can try and edit you out, but also consider to leave your video off and post your comments in the chat. The edited recording of today's event will be available and the link will be circulated to all the participants who have registered. If you've jumped into a link that someone has sent you without registering and you'd like the recording link, please email us and we will make sure to send it to you. And finally, before I get to our panel, I just wanted to say that we at the Social Change Lab are super interested in data. One of the things that happened as a result of this topic coming up for us is we tried to find information about academic repression in Australia, and we found that there isn't very good data. So we've started a survey, and it's only just begun this week, but we do have data from the first 118 people. And so this pie graph shows people's responses. To what extent do you feel like people in your university are free to express their ideas and conduct their academic work without fear of negative consequences? And that dark green slice is the proportion of people who said they're completely free. And it goes all the way down through color coding to red, completely repressed. And so here are the pie charts for your discipline, you yourself personally in your own work and in Australia. And I don't know about you guys, but these are not the numbers I expected to see, and they're not what I want to see when I see academics reporting how they feel. So we have some qualitative data that we'll be interrogating to find out what they mean by academic freedom, but I just thought that's a great way to start our panel. So I'm clicking out of that now and into our wider group. And so, I see Gill acknowledging country in the chat, and if you're Australian or elsewhere for that matter, please do feel free to do so. So what we're going to do now is go to our panel members, and I've asked you to speak to 3 questions. You know, why do people go after universities? And then what are the forces that promote academic repression and democratic backsliding, the interconnections, the processes? And what can we do as scholars and as advocates in this space? So I want to begin with Yasemin. You have written recently a review piece on some of this, and would you like to tell us about that or other aspects of your work and your reflections?
Sure. I think it's such a big topic, and so I was having a really hard time coming up with notes for this. So I'm gonna speak to just a couple of points, I think, and then maybe depending on how the conversation develops, we can come back to other things. So you mentioned a paper that Melis and I did with another colleague of ours, Nevin, and this was reflecting a bit on our own experiences of trying to do research in Turkey, the experiences of others, but also bringing in aspects of not just the impact on researchers, but also the impact on participants and on the research, the quality of the research itself, and how all aspects of this can be impacted when there are elements of academic repression. And academic repression, I think, functions for a few different reasons. It's coming about for a few different reasons. First is the university itself. The university is where the next generation learns what it is that it needs to know to live and the ideas that it develops for the future. It's where different types of people meet and come together. And when you have an authoritarian government or a state apparatus that is interested in promoting a particular perspective on the world, particularly one where that state apparatus is the correct one, then a university is a very logical place to target. And I think that was definitely our experience as people who are trying to do research, in Turkey, particularly around a conflict, the Turkish-Kurdish conflict that involved state narratives. And the difficulties that we faced around censorship, around access to participants, around even getting ethical approval, were all different sorts of issues that we experienced during that process. So I think I could speak very narrowly to our experiences of that. I could speak very narrowly to my experiences of a particular type of repression, but I can also speak to why I think, these things happen more generally. And I'm looking forward to hearing how other people have thought about these questions as well.
Yeah, thank you, Yasmin. And I know that the time is going to go by in a flash. So
Yeah,
I will just kind of
exactly.
circle the group and loop back, and we'll
Hmm.
see how much we have time for. I'd
Great.
like to encourage everyone as well to put some questions and comments into the chat as you go. Don't feel you have to wait. And you can be reading the chat speakers and responding to that as you go. We don't, or not. So Melis, did you want to add anything in this context or to how Yasemin has begun? So another co-author of this important piece, which I'll just put the link in the chat in a moment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Winifred. And I was actually planning to do the same. So yeah, thanks for putting it in the chat. I guess like, yeah, very similar things I wanna highlight, like in addition to Yasemin's point, but I also wanna say a few words on why they go after universities, because I feel like universities play this kind of like middle role, like between politicians and like the rest of the society, while universities shape, like young people's mind, as Yasemin just mentioned. I also feel like because they are mostly experts in their field, they can also shape like what policymakers can do, what politicians can do. So whenever a government makes a mistake, it's usually universities that call out, right? Like they're like, hey, this is not
Mm.
okay. This is not good for our societies. This is not good for environment. Whatever the issue is, it's usually the universities that say no or yes to something, something should happen. So I think they have this middle role, I would say, in social hierarchy. And most of the time, because universities, as I said, like shape students, right, like their minds, and students also kind of like shape society's futures, right? Like that is what we see in Chile, that's what we see in Turkey. I just want to give the recent examples of student protest in Turkey, for example. So when there was more pressure and when there was more repression, especially after the Istanbul mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu was arrested in Turkey, so there was a huge backlash. There was like a huge protests initiated by students, and this student protest shaped like how the society was going to respond to this more repression in Turkey, for example. And then after this protest, more and more people from different parts of society joined the protest, and after that people were like, okay, like we have been silent for, I don't know, like 13 years, like after, oh, no, not 13, 12 years after the Gezi Park protest, so it is time to take action. It is time to do something. So it's actually the students who started all of these protests. So I believe that whenever governments think that they can repress universities, they believe that they can repress students, their movements, their actions, anything that is related to that. And I'm gonna stop here because if you don't stop me, I can talk forever. So yeah, I just want to give the floor to others. Thank you.
Yeah, we will be rotating in very speedy way so that we can have as much content as possible. Stephen, you're an eminent scholar of disinformation. You've been looking at the climate context. How do you respond to these questions?
Well, my my view is that you really got to zoom out a lot and ask, what's going on? What's the motivation here? What's the project that is being pursued? And when you do that, then in my opinion, there's pretty good evidence to suggest that right now we have a number of identifiable, very powerful individuals and political operatives and movements that are trying to abolish democracy. It's as simple as that. And replace it by some sort of authoritarian regime. And we can debate whether that's, autocracy or fascism or populism or whatever. Whatever it is, it's not democratic, not pluralistic, and it is trying to abolish liberal democracies. And those movements are operating globally. They've taken over in the United States, in some European countries, and they're a threat everywhere. Now, I'm happy to die on that hill. I mean, that's what I think is happening, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. And it's happening in broad daylight, by the way. There isn't too much of a mystery here. There's no conspiracy. The ICE goons in the US are out in broad daylight snatching people off the street. That's not exactly secret. So,
Yeah.
And everything else follows from that, because, what gets in the way of that project? Well, institutions like the justice system, like the media, like independent universities, and hence all three of those are targets of the current Trump administration. He's going after the media with specious lawsuits, and then sometimes he's bullying them into settling lawsuits that, the media companies were most likely going to win because Trump's suit had no basis. But nonetheless, the intimidation works. We have concrete steps where that's happening in the US and concrete outcomes to trace that. Then the justice system, the same thing. Trump is now going after judges who oppose him, even if he appointed them.
That's certainly true. Yeah.
Yeah, and again,
Let's keep the focus on uni, though, if that's okay.
Of course, no, I'm just saying, we got to have the whole context. And then when it comes to universities, well, it's exactly the same thing. Of course, they have to get rid of universities. Of course, they have to, make sure that no one talks about racism and capitalism and all those nasty things in a university. And so they're very explicitly getting rid of all those things. Now, they're extremely clever about it because, of course, they're doing all this under the banner of combating anti-Semitism and defending free speech. I mean, at first glance, if you didn't know anything else, you'd have to say, yeah, that's really cool. Now, of course, that is just window dressing for something that is far more nefarious. So in my opinion, that's what it is. It's actually quite simple if you think about it, but they're very clever about it. And very few people sort of see the big picture, but they're only saying, Florida, DeSantis is doing something weird here. Well, no, it's part of a bigger project. And that, I think, to me, is important to realize.
Yeah, I think it is too. And we've already seen the Turkish, the American context. Gill, you have a background as a human rights lawyer and advocate. You've worked in a variety of different contexts, including Australia. How do you respond to these questions?
Well, let me say this. I agree with Stephen's overall picture when applied to certain areas and certain countries. But here in Australia, we like our tinnies, our beer, and the beach. And I don't really see the authoritarian project here in Australia. But you asked in your notes, you wanted to hear something from us about our perspective and our experience. Let me start with a perspective. I'm now on the panel of a People's Inquiry into the repression of speech, free speech, and academic freedom on university campuses in this country. And my perspective is based on a reading of over 150 submissions from students, staff, alumni, organizations, and just plain citizens, and a very broad and diverse set of issues have been raised in those submissions. I mean, it's pretty horrific, actually, what's going on in Australian universities. And this is being driven by the government, the media, Murdoch media in particular. And I actually want to, and the pro-Israel and Zionist lobbies, I don't conflate them, just as we shouldn't conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, which is a big problem here because the university group, the universities, Australian universities has adopted a new definition, roughly like the older IHRA definition. And this new definition has been accepted by some universities, rejected by others. But it does conflate any criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. My own experience actually was in Northern Ireland in 1974. There was published a document called Nothing to Hide, the Boehringer case and academic freedom in Northern Ireland. And all you have to do is Google Nothing to Hide, something like that. You'll probably find it. But I think it's an exemplary case of what I am very concerned about. And that is not so much the external forces, which our other colleagues have mentioned and described and analyzed, with which I agree. But I want to focus on the universities themselves. The self-immolation of Australian universities is happening today. The way they have become complicit with the government, with the media, with the lobbies that I mentioned before, is shameful, it's disgraceful. The disciplining of staff and students, the coercion to change course materials, the dismissal.
Yes, I really agree.
Yeah. I'll just finish. There is clearly an atmosphere of fear in the universities. We've received submissions about I think 21 of the universities, all indicating that silencing is happening, self-censorship is happening.
Yeah. That leads us to our next
about it
question,
for now.
doesn't it? Yeah, thanks, Gill. Leads us to our next question, which is about some of the processes that are promoting both academic repression and democratic backsliding. And I think the development of silencing and taboos, the development of impunity, fear of attacks by the right-wing media, these are some of the processes that come to my mind from your speakers, from your 4 presentations. Could I ask you to reflect on that? Back to you, Yasemin.
Yeah, I think the first thing that came to my mind when I was thinking about this question is the sort of very conscious tactics that authoritarian regimes are using to sort of create a distance between academia and society as a whole, viewing scientific research or academics or academia as elitist, as out of touch, as disconnected from people's realities, from their lived experiences, and then sort of suggesting that scientific research then therefore is a sort of elitist opinion rather than based on some sort of empirical evidence, and that this then can support democratic backsliding when, as Melis was I think rightly pointing out, universities can act as, or, people as part of universities can act as these sort of watchdogs to say, hey, actually, that's not true, or this is a problem. Now those voices are not taken seriously. So when you've created this sort of sense of disconnect between the institution and society, you can now disregard those voices. In a similar way, this is why I think narratives are so important, right? So saying that academics are terrorists is the experience that we have in particular, but that Stephan had mentioned anti-Semitism, so saying that actually people are engaged in anti-Semitism, any of these different sorts of things are tactics that are being used to discredit and discount anything that people in institutions like the university have to say. So I think this is how you see a potential watchdog to democratic backsliding being silenced. I'm gonna leave it with just that point because I want to hear what others have to say about this as well.
Yeah, I think it's an important point. Melis, over to you. How do you build on that?
Well, yeah, I guess like this university is kind of like historically, I would say that freedom of expression has always been encouraged at universities, right? So this academic repression in general like undermines democratic principles, like by curbing like free speech or like suppressing dissent, or I think the idea is more like limit access to these diverse ideas, right? Like especially in authoritarian regimes, what we see is like it's more like a uniform and everyone agrees on something, but that is not true. Like there is always like heterogeneity of ideas, but we don't really, or at least the governments or the state in authoritarian regimes, they don't want us to see it like that, right? But universities provide a platform for this variety of ideas. I guess like the idea behind suppressing this diversity is to weak the like intellectual environment, and like when they do that, it also erodes democratic resilience.
Yeah.
And then I also want to say like scholars like at universities, when academic scholars students are silenced, I also feel like although it's not our role, but at the same time I feel like societies lose this like balance and check position, right? Because like universities play that role in a way informally, I would say. And then but when we are silenced, we can't really play that role because we can't have a say in the problems our societies are facing. That would be my like immediate I guess response to that.
Yeah, that's excellent. Stephen, one connection to disinformation that seems really obvious is that people end up having to debate, whether scholars are anti-Semitic or whether scholars are terrorists. But actually, you just are taking away airtime from the real problems that you could be talking about. Do you make that connection between the narratives that accompany academic repression and other forms of disinformation?
Of course. There's a very interesting narrative that's been very successful in the United States concerning misinformation, and that is to label research into misinformation as censorship, which is a complete fantasy, of course. But that has been done extremely successfully by the usual people, the Trump administration and their allies, including Musk, who's been at the forefront of that. So yeah, not only are we awash in disinformation, we're now no longer allowed to study disinformation in the United States because it is the censorship, which it isn't, of course.
Could I just stop you there for a second? Because I don't know if the audience will know that what Stephen said is not a metaphor. It's actually the case. So universities have banned scholars from studying misinformation, and an important center of misinformation research has been shut down by its own university.
At Stanford, the Stanford case, okay, there's so much to talk about. The Stanford case is a little bit complicated because they did spend $6 million first defending the SAO. And then they decided that they just couldn't afford it anymore. And so they weasel themselves out of that. The SIO, still, the Stanford Internet Observatory, still exists, but it has been
Okay.
completely repurposed, defanged, and some key people have left to other positions in academia. So, but yeah, I mean, most of my colleagues in the US have had their NSF grants canceled, including one person studying misinformation about cancer. Okay.
Wow.
So you kind of think, well, hang on, don't you want people to be informed about cancer? But no, the word misinformation was in there, and then some robot or some of Musk's incels, they just decided to cancel that. So yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of cancellations happening in the United States. I don't know about Australia. My own experience, and I live in the UK, but I'm also spending a lot of time in Germany for some reason. I have not been subject to cancellation or any administrative action from my university to stop doing what I'm doing. However, what is happening in the UK, what is possibly even more pernicious, is the death of academia by mouse click. Because every single day there's another form we have to fill in, from our size on to, who's your dentist, what's your vet for your dog. I mean, it is stuff of insanity that is hard to describe. And we have a new form every week for everything, and then we have to enter the
I think we have to have our own seminar on corporate managerialism and neoliberalism.
Exactly. And I think precisely, I was going to say, managerialism is killing academia. Even when they're not trying to censor you, it is simply dying under the assault of mouse clicks. And
okay, but I want to bring us back, sorry to jump in, bring us back to the processes that promote academic repression in a narrower sense. Gill, over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about your perspective in terms of the legal frameworks that both protect universities and democracy, or that underpin and harm to them both? Or is that a way that you think about it?
Not really, because the law is not very effective in these areas.
Okay, that's such an interesting perspective.
Law,
I didn't know what the lawyers would say. So it's not the law, it's norms, social norms, or...
But let me say this. I wanted to follow up on what Stephen was saying about managerialism. There's been a book recently published here in Australia. It's brand new, by Josh Bernstein, who is a lawyer, a very well-known and highly respected lawyer. It's called Working for the Brand: How Corporations Are Destroying Free Speech. In that, he does have something to say about universities. And for those of you in the UK, I found it quite interesting to learn that, and I'll quote, or paraphrase actually, but I'll read: university hiring of marketing and HR staff from 2005 grew 9 times faster than hirings of academics. And that links up to my position that a lot of this in some countries, certainly here, is driven by the university's protection of its own reputation or brand, if you will. Bornstein also says brand management and academic freedom are mortal enemies.
It's so interesting because, sorry if I just jump in here. To me, the reputation of being a champion of academic freedom is an incredible plus. Yeah. So I don't think we should like lightly accept the idea that it's fantastic for an academic institution to become known for its timidity, intellectual cowardice, and weakness. Yeah. So I think, part of my question is, how is this happening? Where are the ideals of yore? I think you pointed to hiring practices, Gill, and I think we can kind of speak to that in academia in the UK, perhaps in the US, I don't know. We are seeing that academic leaders have been replaced by people hired from corporations and from the commercial sector. So it used to be traditional for professors to become deans and then vice chancellors. That's no longer the case here. I don't know what it's like in the US, and in the UK, it seems very similar. Do you think that there's greater timidity when people are bringing a financial perspective or a financial motive, Yasemin, to the academic management role?
Sure.
Oh,
Guilty.
I wasn't prepared for that.
Don't feel like you have to comment about your university. We can speak in the third person.
No, it's fine. I think I would, being based in the UK at the moment, I guess I've been in meetings where there's discussions of student markets, right? Particular countries' student market and how to sort of
Right.
attract that market, and I find that a bit horrifying because it's antagonistic to the way I view universities, right? As a location for education and learning, but having a sort of business model applied to universities, which is very common here in the UK, I think creates all sorts of issues when it comes to this question of academic freedom, but also academic independence, right? Which are two separate related issues. How do you function independently when you have to deal with potential endowments, when you are worried about the companies or corporations who have a relationship with the university, to what degree you have to be concerned about what the sort of state or government thoughts are about the sort of speech that you make, especially around things like the war in Gaza at the moment has been a big one in the UK, where students have also, along with the US, been quite active, and universities are forced into a sort of making a statement or avoiding making a statement based on who they think they are beholden to, because students think that the university is beholden to them, but in some ways, that's the case, and in some ways it's absolutely not, right? So these sort of financial issues have become more and more important to universities who have been utilizing a business model, right, to run.
And is there, if we draw out that theme of precarity,
Yeah.
is there a sense in which only the wealthier institutions, only Harvard with its enormous endowment, is going to be free to champion traditional academic values? Is that where we're headed, do you think?
I mean, I think it certainly makes it easier. I think the reason we're looking at Harvard sort of pushing it back against all of the pressures that have been put on it by the Trump administration is because Harvard can manage it, though of course there were discussions before Harvard even got to this point. They were in this back and forth to try and to negotiate until they reached a point where they couldn't, right? And it's those types of institutions that have these large endowments who are maybe more, that are in a stronger position to push back, where smaller universities definitely cannot. I don't think it's that dissimilar to the UK, where you again have universities that are in a much stronger position to stand firm on their positions. But I don't know. I guess it depends what we think of traditional sort of academic, because I think we've already moved away from that in a lot of ways, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I'd like to spend the second part of the hour on that trajectory back. So I'm going to come to you in a minute, Melis, but we've already talked about path A to rebuilding academic freedom. Billionaire institutions of enormous wealth and privilege will lead the way. I don't know. I don't know about you as a social scientist, that seems like a very unpromising trajectory. But we do know from, for example, the 19th century that billionaire wealthy philanthropists created institutions like Carnegie and Rockefeller that actually promoted small L liberal values. Melis, do you have a sense of what processes can take us back towards academic freedom and a stronger democracy, and how we can perhaps contribute?
Yeah, but like I just want to follow up on Yasemin's point on this because even though these like big universities you just talk about have like large endowments, but also we need to think about the donors they receive, right? And then like these like donors, it makes a huge difference because most of the time these donors have an agenda and they say they just like give some conditions, right, before they give money, and that is what we are seeing in the UK. Like recently, I just heard from one of my colleagues. I'm not gonna name the university, but for the center, they received like so much money from a country outside, and they said that okay, we are giving you this much money as long as you never criticize our country in the reports you prepare. So like they come with an agenda,
Wow.
right? So it's already like a curbs academic freedom when you receive money from these donors, and then like it's gonna affect the way you do your research, the way you write your report, the outcomes and everything, right? So even if, I mean, that university I'm talking about is a really good one, like, and they have a huge endowment. Even though that's the case, that's also the case, right? So like they have these both elements together. So I think we also need to acknowledge Harvard receives like so much donor as well, right? So it's something we need to be aware of. I guess Winifred, you are asking more about what can we do about this? Is that did I understand you correctly?
Yes,
How
I,
to
I
kind of
feel
like
like we've
yeah,
got
perfect.
22 minutes. Let's
Perfect.
spend some time on that.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, perfect. So I mean, there are different ways to, I guess, push back when we receive, like academic repression. First of all, I want to talk about collective advocacy because that is something both Yasemin and I are familiar with, right? Whenever there was a huge repression on academics for peace in Turkey. We try to build alliances, not just in Turkey, but also in different parts of the world. And one way to do that, we pushed our associations we are part of to take action to protect academic freedom in Turkey, but also to stand in solidarity with academics who receive that kind of repression, who experience this kind of repression. And then, like, I remember one of the things we experienced whenever we pushed our associations, the immediate response at the time, they were like, hey, but we are not political associations, we are scientific associations, so we can't really have a say in this, and we should not really take a position or take a side. Although we agree that it is not okay, we were like, hey, what are you talking about? These are your members, so you should take action, you should stand with them. And then, but I think Yasemin, you may kind of like add more to that, but I don't remember how much time it took for them to take action to publish a like just a statement, to say that, hey, we stand in solidarity with academics in Turkey. So I guess like collective advocacy is the first point. And then I also want to talk a little bit about like Turkey as well, because in the US, in the UK, I think we are seeing repression in different forms. But in authoritarian regimes, what we see also to the universities, usually governments appoint rectors, right? So like the universities do not have a say in it, although like they choose someone. The government says, hey, we don't like that rector you choose. We are appointing someone, and that rector is usually affiliated with the government anyway. And one way to push back, I believe, and that's what they are doing at Boğaziçi University in Turkey, is that they are not accepting that rector. They are protesting against it. And then since 2021, for example, at Boğaziçi University, they have been protesting this appointed rector by the government. Just 5 years, think about it. They are going to the building of the rector, and they're just like turning their behind, and they're protesting for 15 minutes every single workday. So there are different ways to push back, but I'm just gonna stop here and give the floor to others.
Fantastic. Stephen, did you want to comment on how where you see this?
Well, I mean, complicated. Again, I think, if you really want to fix universities, you got to fix societies and what's going on out there. It's the
Yeah.
whole populism framework, the whole project to divide people and, the good people and these nefarious elites. And of course, academics are elites in the eyes of populists. So, if you really want to change something, you gotta fix that narrative and deal with it. But of course, that's a major, that's decades at least, if we're lucky. And in the meantime, I think, you gotta question everything every day, fight back, don't do it, be a squeaky door, throw sand in the machine. I mean, and then sometimes you can just wear them down, and I'm talking about everything, this whole managerialism thing, if somebody wants input on something, good luck. Frankly, I'm not interested. And I think if there's a lot of that kind of grinding slowly. And if you constantly say, this is ridiculous, we can't do our work because everything we do has no relationship to academia. I mean, it's an exaggeration. I still do research, but there's way too much time I'm wasting on things that have nothing to do with anything. Don't produce anything. It's just a machine that operates on its own for its own purpose with no discernible outcome anywhere. And that's a hugely complicated thing and to deal with, but I don't have a silver bullet.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about different processes, and the processes are going to have different solutions, different reinforcing and balancing feedback loops. So they're going to need different approaches. I'm conscious that you and I, Stephen, and probably many people here are kind of full professors with lots of money and wealth. And I don't think that it's always easy for a young person just newly hired to say, I will not fill in your form.
Of course you can't say that, but you can do it after, excuse me, you can do it after the third reminder, I mean, and then
I know someone
sometimes a surprising number of times things sort of do go away. I used to be the kind of person who'd do stuff when I got the email. I'd say, okay, I'll get it out of the line. I deeply regret that I used to do this because, you got to wait. And sometimes it just disappears and there are no reminders. And so then that's a bit more time you can use to be an academic.
Yeah, fantastic. I love that advice. Delete the emails, everyone. This is part of a project of reclaiming academic freedom. Yeah. Gill, what are your thoughts as you hear this conversation?
Yeah, well, I agree with what Yasemin has said in the chat. Communications and global connections is a key. Publicize and organize. Solidarity is the key to defense. In 1915, the first formal organization, so far as I know, was established by the American Association of University Professors to look into violations of academic freedom in universities of the USA, including the president of a university. Times have changed. In my own case, the Committee on Academic Freedom and Democracy, run by then Professor John Griffiths, a law professor at London University. They took my case. A fellow came from London over to Belfast and spent a considerable amount of time looking into the case. And that CAFD is now called the Council for Academic Freedom and Academic Standards. And of course, we should mention scholars at risk.
Yes.
And I would say that because I've been on the panel of more than a dozen people's inquiries or people's tribunals or citizens' inquiries, that is a very good way of publicizing and organizing around this issue, getting the data and circulating it. And then, as we've done in another inquiry that I'm on coal-fired power stations, you have a roadshow. You go out to the community. You say, look, this is what's going on. This is not good for this country. So I think, it's a long struggle. Galileo faced it. there's more than just academic freedom, it's intellectual freedom wherever located. And we have to know that in these universities, particularly perhaps in Australia, there have been massive fights in my own law school, in political economy or traditional economics at Sydney, and also in philosophy, where in the end there were divisions and new departments created. But you know, it is a struggle that continues and has for a very, very long time. Usually in any country, there's one narrative that has to be followed, whether it's in the universities or wherever. And if you're not on the side that is accepted by the rulers of that country, the powerful interests of that country, then you're going to have to fight to be able to continue with the work that you want to do on behalf of the people.
Yeah, I think there is that dimension that we haven't been talking about, maybe, of how within a particular university system like Australia, some topics are more dangerous to scholars than others. Some dissent is more okay in the eyes of the university than others. And how can we understand that and leverage that? So, for example, I'm having this panel right now on academic freedom with a certain degree of confidence that there wouldn't be any pushback from my university. I'll keep you guys posted. But I think that when we frame things in a certain way, we can sometimes create or leverage to open the door wider. Do you have any thoughts or advice on that, Yasemin?
I think there's lots of different advice that we can benefit from, and I think one of the ways that we get access to that advice is what I had put in the chat, because I was too impatient to wait until I had to say it. Was I think one of the ways that we learn how to manage these things is to be able to meet with other people who are dealing with it in other places, who have gone through different aspects of this before in different ways. And it is through these connections. I mean, here we have an opportunity to hear about the way that academic repression has been experienced in different countries and contexts. Some of it is bureaucratic, some of it is managerial, some of it is direct state interference, some of it is censorship, some self-censorship. And knowing that there are loads of different ways that this manifests is also going to help us in making decisions about how to act against it. Because also, as you mentioned, Winnifred, some people are in higher status positions. There are early career researchers who have maybe never experienced maybe they have an experience of censorship and they don't know how to handle it because they've never had to deal with it before. They might normalize it. So our ability to connect and communicate and talk through these situations, to say, hey, this might be normalized where you are, but it's definitely not okay, and here's a way for you to think about it and combat it, are super key. And also, as you say, some topics are going to be more, in quotes, taboo or more likely to be censored than other topics. So then there are ways to communicate with our colleagues to maybe support them through that research process, right? It could be having a remote affiliation at another institution. It could be by not necessarily having your name on a funding application, but being able to still produce research about that topic. And the way that we do that is through connection, through communication, through solidarity, through knowing what each other are going through and being able to find ways to manage and to, as Stephen also said, to just put things in the gears to slow things down if that's the case. But the experience of academic repression is coming from loads of different sources depending on where you are in the world, and depending on where you are in the world, you're going to approach it differently. So I think it's good to have a good breadth of knowledge about this and experience with people who have gone through it before.
Yeah, and I'll just share in this context, my own advisor said to me, and I found this to be good advice in my career, that if you're going to do controversial, dangerous stuff, you should also have a mainstream line of work with mainstream methods published in mainstream journals. And the other thing that's kind of connected to that is he said to me, it's always good to teach first-year psychology and stats. Now, of course, everyone from different disciplines, please translate that into your own context. But the point is, if you take on some forms of teaching that are less popular, that are more valued by the administration, sometimes that gives you a little bit of wiggle room. And it's about trying to find those ways to position yourself. Sometimes it can be a bit nuanced and context specific, but I'm sharing that in the spirit of good advice. Melis, over to you. What are your thoughts or your advice?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a lot to think about. But again, like following on like Yasemin's point, there are definitely certain topics like we either, I mean, I don't do it myself, but I find thinking about it, right? Like, for example, after I left Turkey and after I started working on the Turkish-Kurdish conflict, and whenever I visited my colleagues in Turkey, they were like, "Ah, you're so lucky because you are abroad, like, so you can't really study this topic here in this country, right?" And now, I mean, I was just back in the days, I was thinking maybe this is unique to Turkey, and now I can see how common, how widespread it is. Because, for example, my PhD student, who is from Germany, and she is focusing on Palestinian solidarities. And now she's so afraid of publishing her work because she thinks that if she publishes something on Palestine, when she goes back to Germany, she may not find a job for herself. So like all of these threats are real, and we sometimes think that like those kind of things happen in authoritarian regimes, but it doesn't really apply to more democratic regimes. I call so-called democratic regimes, but it is happening everywhere. I guess this discussion also shows that, right? I guess I also want to add a little bit onto the points Stephen mentioned, is like educating the public. How can we do that? Like, because especially if they see us as elites, like we are kind of like maybe we are not seeing the reality, right? That's how they see us. I mean, one way to think more about this, to use more participatory approaches when we do research, right? That is something Yasemin and like other colleagues are trying to do as well. So like when we actually invite the public, to become a participant from the start, and when we do research together, I think first of all, we produce something meaningful, but at the same time we kind of like bring this gap between society and universities together, right? So there's not going to be so much gap, I guess, and this is one way to educate the public as well as learning from them. So I don't really want to do this like, yeah, we are here and we are going to educate the public, but we also learn a lot from them when we do research. And this is one way to also build some really good connections and solidarities between universities and the public. And whenever governments attack us, then the public is going to support us as well. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, that's great. Stephen, what are your thoughts at this point?
Yeah, I wish I had any. I'm trapped in this space where I feel I'm pretty good at analyzing things, or at least I have a lot to say about that. And then somebody says, "Oh, what are we going to do?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't know." So it's very hard for me to be sure. What I can say, what I think is important, is that I think we all have a little more power and a little more wiggle room than we might be tempted to think, because it's so scary and so many other people are suffering. In my experience, and yes, I'm a senior, I'm white, male, old, and privileged, and I know all that. But in my case, I found that you can be outspoken, really, and you can resist. And I've had an army of trolls go after me trying to get me fired, and they weren't successful. That's not to say it wasn't stressful or intimidating at the time, but I think we do have a little more leverage than we might think, especially if we're working together with other academics, and if we're a constant presence in the media or elsewhere, then it becomes much harder for the trolls to dislodge us. I've traced the visibility of several colleagues and of myself, and we sort of talk to each other, and once you have a certain level of prominence that makes it clear you're not going anywhere, You know, like I have a colleague in climate science who's on TV in the US once a week, and they have now left him alone pretty much completely. You know, you get the occasional crank email, but no longer this assault vis-a-vis the university. And the same has happened to me. I'm almost lonely now. I don't, no one has complained about it for years. And I'm like, what's going on here? You know, maybe I'm irrelevant now. But what's happening is that they back off when you show character.
Yeah, and I think maybe speaking a bit more about that, like if you are from a kind of combative and contrarian personality, which is not unknown in academia, and in fact is sometimes part of our superpowers, you know, then you can embrace that challenge of standing up to bullies and seeing what happens. But even if your strength is to be relational, you may be able to articulate that and form that relationship with your dean or with your head of school, and that gives you the security to move forward from. So there's different ways to, you know, butter your bread. And I think sometimes as long as you can find the security, that can give you the confidence. Gill, I'm going to come to you for the last word. What are your thoughts or your advice at this point?
Well, one thought, the bullies usually attack the weak, and we're finding in our submissions that it's the casual teachers, you know, the part-timers and others, but attacking them successfully creates that atmosphere of fear. But getting back to communication, I think it is possible and important to get the word out, and I do recommend people's inquiries. We're having public hearings next month, and in my experience, they attract media attention and bring the issue right out into the open, and people in the community get to see the arguments and make their choice.
Yeah,
Thank
that's great. And I guess, thank you, Gill. Part of that, I'll just say again that we're trying at the moment to run a survey of Australian academics. So we will send it out when we send out the link to this, and hope that you promote it through your networks, because collecting data and sharing these stories, breaking the silence, rejecting the taboos, and documenting Gill's very important point about the vulnerability of younger academics, casual academics, people without continuing positions, you know, is going to be really important, and working with other stakeholders. This has been such a rich and fabulous discussion, and I'll just ask everyone who is here as an audience member to join me in applauding our brilliant panel. That's dumb. And you can applaud each other too. That's fabulous. And yeah, I think, you know, such an important discussion. I really echo the words in the chat. So we will keep to time. We will wrap up here, but I want to say thank you to the panel from myself personally. This has been such an important contribution to the festival, and I look forward to sharing the recording with a wider audience as well.
Can we also
Thanks,
say
Victor.
thank you,
Rowan.
Winnifred, for
Thank you.
organizing this? Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
terrific.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you. Have
Okay,
a good
great.
day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye now.